They said I had no name, no blood, no right to stand among them, and I let them believe it because the truth was a blade I had sworn never to unsheathe. But when my husband called me a fraud before the highest court in London, I realized that some promises are meant to be broken, and some silences are simply another form of death. I remember the morning of the trial with the clarity reserved for moments that cleave a life in two. The fog hung low over the city, thick as wet wool, muting the clatter of carriage wheels and the distant bells of St. Paul's. I stood before the window of my small rented room in Cheapside, watching the grey light seep through the glass, and I thought of all the mornings I had woken in Blackwood Manor, in silken sheets that smelled of lavender, beside a man I had believed loved me. How foolish I had been, how utterly, devastatingly foolish. The room was cold, the fire having died sometime in the night, and I had not bothered to rekindle it. What was the point? In a few hours, I would stand before a courtroom full of strangers and be stripped of whatever dignity I had left. The woman who had once been Lady Blackwood would be revealed as nothing more than a common deceiver, an adventuress who had tricked her way into a noble family. That was the story Cedric had crafted, and the world was eager to believe it. I pressed my palm against the window, feeling the cold glass beneath my skin, and I wondered if my father had felt this way in his final days. Cornelius Vane, the Baron d'Aether, the most brilliant inventor of his age, hunted by men who wanted what he possessed. Had he stood at a window like this one, watching the fog roll in, knowing that his enemies were closing in? Had he thought of me, the daughter he had given away to protect, and wondered if his sacrifice had been worth it? I would never know. He had died before I could meet him, before I could ask him any of the questions that had haunted me since Mrs. Ashford's confession. All I had of him was a medallion of brass and silver, a letter written in faded ink, and a legacy I had never asked for. My name, the one I had carried for 26 years, was Eleanor Ashford, daughter of Thomas Ashford, a textile merchant who had died in debt when I was 17, and Mary Ashford, a seamstress who had followed him to the grave within the year. That was the story I had told Cedric when he courted me, the story I had repeated to his mother, to his sisters, to every aristocrat who had looked at me with thinly veiled contempt at dinner parties and balls. It was not entirely a lie. The Ashfords had raised me. They had loved me in their quiet, worn-down way. But they were not my blood. My blood was something else entirely. My blood was fire and lightning and the hum of machines that defied comprehension. My blood was Cornelius Vane. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I came to stand in that courtroom, how I came to be mocked and reviled, and how I rose from the ashes of my own destruction like something reborn. Let me tell you about the man who broke me and the man who saved me. Let me tell you about ghosts and machines and the thin line between science and madness. Let me tell you my story from the beginning. I was born in the winter of 1862, though I did not know the circumstances of my birth until much later. The Ashfords found me on their doorstep on Christmas morning, wrapped in a blanket embroidered with a pattern of interlocking gears and stars. Pinned to my swaddling clothes was a medallion of unusual design, brass and silver twisted together in a spiral, and at its center, a small crystal that seemed to pulse with faint blue light. There was no note, no explanation, only me, a squalling infant with dark hair and gray eyes, left to the mercy of strangers. Thomas and Mary Ashford were good people, simple people, who had longed for a child of their own and never been blessed with one. They took me in without hesitation, named me Eleanor after Mary's mother, and raised me as their daughter. They never spoke of the circumstances of my arrival, and I, knowing no different, never thought to ask. I grew up in a modest house in Kent, attended a modest school, learned to read and sew and comport myself like a respectable young woman. I was happy in my way, though there was always something restless in me, a feeling that I did not quite belong. that I was meant for something more than the quiet life my parents had planned for me. When I was 15, Thomas Ashford's business began to fail. The textile trade was changing, factories replacing the small merchants who had once dominated the industry, and Thomas could not adapt. He borrowed money he could not repay, made deals that turned sour, trusted men who betrayed him. By the time I was 17, we had lost everything. The house was sold, the furniture was auctioned. Thomas, broken by shame and despair, took to his bed and never rose again. He died in the spring of my 17th year, and Mary, who had been the quiet strength of our family, seemed to die with him. She lingered for another year, growing thinner and paler, her spirit fading like a candle guttering in the wind. And then she was gone too, and I was alone. It was on her deathbed that Mary told me the truth. I remember the room, the smell of sickness and candle wax, the thin gray light filtering through the curtains, Mary's hand in mine, her fingers like twigs, her eyes bright with fever. She asked me to bring her the box she kept beneath her bed, the one I had never been permitted to open. I did as she asked, and she pressed it into my hands with what little strength she had left. Inside was the medallion I had been found with, the one she had hidden away all those years. And beneath it, a letter. Mary told me, her voice barely a whisper, that I was not her daughter by blood. She told me that a man had come to their door on that Christmas morning, a man in a dark coat with wild eyes and trembling hands. He had begged them to take me, to raise me as their own, to tell no one of my true parentage. He had given them money, more money than they had ever seen, and made them swear an oath of secrecy. He had said that there were people who would kill to find me, people who must never learn of my existence. And then he had disappeared into the fog, and they had never seen him again. The letter was from him, from Cornelius Vane. I read it by the light of a single candle, my hands shaking, while Mary watched me with eyes full of sorrow. The letter explained everything and nothing. It told me that I was his daughter, born of a brief union with a woman named Clara, who had died bringing me into the world. It told me that he had enemies, powerful men who would use me to control him, and that the only way to keep me safe was to give me away. It told me that he loved me, though he had never held me, never heard my voice, never watched me grow. And it told me that if I ever needed to prove my identity, the medallion would be my key. I did not understand, not then. I did not know who Cornelius Vane was or why his enemies would want to harm a child. I did not know about Aether or the Society of Absolute Progress or the experiments that had made my father both famous and feared. I knew only that my life, which I had thought I understood, was a lie. That the parents who had raised me were not my parents. That somewhere out there I had a father who had abandoned me to protect me and enemies who would destroy me if they could. Mary died the next morning. I buried her beside Thomas in the churchyard outside our village, and I stood alone at their graves, clutching the medallion to my chest, and I made a vow. I would not let their sacrifice be in vain. I would keep my father's secret, whatever it was. I would live quietly, unobtrusively, and never give anyone reason to suspect that I was anything other than plain Eleanor Ashford, orphan and nobody. I kept that vow for nearly a decade. After the Ashfords' deaths, I had no money and no prospects. I sold what little remained of their possessions and used the funds to complete my education, such as it was. I found work as a governess, first for a family in Sussex, then for another in Hampshire, then for a minor baronet in London whose children were terrors and whose wife was kind but ineffectual. I learned to make myself useful, to be quiet and competent and invisible. I learned to navigate the complicated hierarchies of wealthy households, to placate demanding mistresses and soothe fractious children. I learned to expect nothing and want nothing and need nothing. And then I met Cedric Blackwood. I met him at a charity concert in the spring of 1886. I was working as a governess then, employed by the Baronet Sir Harold Ashton, and I had been permitted to attend only because Lady Ashton wished to appear benevolent by bringing her children's governess along. The concert was held at the Langham Hotel, a glittering affair meant to raise funds for an orphanage in Whitechapel, and I wore a dress of dark blue wool, modest and well-mended, standing near the back of the room, invisible among the silks and satins. The music was beautiful, Chopin's nocturnes played by a young pianist whose name I have long since forgotten, and I lost myself in it for a while. I closed my eyes and let the notes wash over me, forgetting where I was and who I was supposed to be. I forgot that I was a servant among masters, a sparrow among peacocks. I was simply Eleanor, alone with the music, and for a few minutes, that was enough. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me. Cedric Blackwood was tall, golden-haired, with the kind of face that portrait painters dream of, and the easy confidence of a man who has never been denied anything in his life. He stood across the room, a champagne flute in his hand, his blue eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my cheeks flush. I looked away, embarrassed, certain that I had done something wrong, that I had somehow drawn attention to myself when I should have remained invisible. But when I glanced back, he was still watching, and then he was walking toward me. He asked me if I was enjoying the music. His voice was warm, cultured, with a hint of amusement that I did not understand. I told him I found Chopin melancholy but beautiful. He laughed and said that was the most honest answer he had received all evening. Everyone else, he said, had been too busy pretending to appreciate the music to actually listen to it. We talked for an hour. He asked about my work, my interests, my opinions on everything from literature to politics. He listened with what seemed like genuine attention, nodding and asking follow-up questions, treating me not like a servant, but like an equal. I was flattered and confused, and more than a little suspicious. Men like Cedric Blackwood did not seek out governesses at charity concerts. They did not stand in corners having earnest conversations while their peers danced and drank and schemed. There had to be some catch, some ulterior motive I could not see. But if there was, I could not find it. And when the concert ended and he asked if he might call on me, I found myself saying yes. I should have said no. I should have recognized the danger in his smile, the way his eyes lingered on my face as though I were a puzzle he intended to solve. I should have remembered my vow to live quietly, unobtrusively, to never draw attention to myself. But I was lonely, and I was tired, and he was so very charming. I said yes, and that single word changed everything. The courtship was a whirlwind. Cedric was relentless in his attention, showering me with flowers, with books of poetry, with invitations to galleries and parks. He sent me notes every day, little missives filled with observations and compliments and private jokes that made me laugh despite myself. The first bouquet arrived the morning after we met, white roses wrapped in paper the color of cream, with a card that read simply, "For the honest woman." I pressed one of those roses between the pages of my Bible, where it remained until the day I left Blackwood Manor with nothing but the clothes on my back. He took me to the British Museum on a Tuesday afternoon, when the galleries were quiet and the lights slanted through the high windows like honey. We stood before the Elgin marbles for hours, and he listened while I spoke of Athens and Pericles and the tragedy of beauty stolen from its home. He did not mock my learning or express surprise that a governess should know such things. He asked questions, real questions, and listened to my answers as though they mattered. He took me to Kew Gardens on a day of gentle rain, the kind that misted the air and turned the paths to mirrors. We walked beneath umbrellas that dripped at the edges, and he named every flower we passed, making up ridiculous Latin names when he did not know the real ones. Rosa impossibilis, he called one, the impossible rose, because it bloomed in defiance of all logic. He made me laugh, truly laugh, for the first time in years. There were concerts in shadowed halls where the music seemed to speak directly to my heart. There were carriage rides through Hyde Park at sunset, the sky painted in shades of rose and gold. There were stolen moments in conservatories and galleries and the quiet corners of crowded rooms, moments when he would look at me with such intensity that I forgot to breathe. He made me feel seen, valued, cherished, all the things I had never dared to want. He made me believe that I deserved happiness, that it was not something reserved for others, for women of better birth and greater fortune. He made me believe in him. His family disapproved, of course. The Blackwoods were an ancient line, their title stretching back to the Wars of the Roses, and here was their heir pursuing a governess with no connections and no fortune. Lady Blackwood, his mother, summoned me to tea and interrogated me about my parentage with the precision of a magistrate. Her drawing room was immaculate, every surface gleaming, every piece of furniture arranged with mathematical precision. She sat opposite me in a chair that seemed more throne than seat, her silver hair swept up in an elaborate coiffure, her gray eyes cold as the North Sea. She asked where I had been born, who my parents were, where I had been educated, what my expectations were. I answered truthfully, as far as I could. I was the daughter of a merchant. I had been educated at a modest school in Kent. I had no inheritance, no prospects, nothing to offer but myself. She dismissed me with a cold nod, her contempt so palpable I could taste it. I thought that would be the end of it. I was certain that Cedric would bow to his mother's wishes, that he would apologize and withdraw, and I would return to my quiet life of invisibility. Part of me even hoped for it. The intensity of his attention frightened me. I did not know how to be loved, how to accept affection without suspicion. I kept waiting for the mask to slip, for the trap to spring. But Cedric defied her. He told his mother that he would marry whomever he chose, with or without her blessing. He told his sisters, who had snubbed me at every opportunity, that they would learn to accept me or lose him entirely. He was magnificent in his rebellion, a golden prince defying his court for the sake of a common girl. I was swept away by it, by him, by the fairy tale he seemed to be offering. He proposed to me on a rainy afternoon in Hyde Park, beneath the shelter of an ancient oak. The rain drummed on the leaves above us, and his hair was damp, curling slightly at the temples, and he knelt in the mud without hesitation, ruining his fine trousers. He told me he had never met anyone like me. He told me I was intelligent and kind and beautiful. He told me he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me if I would have him. I said yes. I said yes because I loved him, or believed I did, or perhaps simply because I wanted so desperately to be loved. I said yes because he made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth fighting for. I said yes because I had been alone for so long, and here was someone offering me a hand, a home, a future. I did not know that I was signing my own death warrant. We were married in June of 1887, in a small ceremony attended by a handful of Cedric's friends and none of his family. Lady Blackwood did not speak to me for 6 months. When she finally relented, it was with the air of a woman accepting an incurable disease. She looked at me as though I were a stain on her carpet, something unsightly but unavoidable, and I learned quickly that I would never be welcome in her world. I became Lady Blackwood, mistress of a great estate, and I told myself that I had found happiness at last. The manor was beautiful, a sprawling Jacobean pile set in hundreds of acres of rolling parkland, with mullioned windows and climbing roses and a long gravel drive lined with ancient oaks. I wandered its corridors like a ghost, marveling at the paintings and tapestries, the suits of armor and the crystal chandeliers. I had servants now, people who curtsied when I entered a room and called me my lady, with varying degrees of sincerity. I had gowns of silk and velvet, jewels that sparkled in the candlelight, a carriage with my husband's crest on the door. I had everything I had never dared to dream of, and I had never been more miserable. The first year of our marriage was pleasant enough, if distant. Cedric was often away, tending to business he never explained, and when he was home, he was distracted, his mind elsewhere. The passionate suitor who had knelt in the mud of Hyde Park had vanished, replaced by a polite stranger who kissed my cheek at breakfast and retired to his study after dinner. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages cooled after the first flush of romance. I filled my days with reading, with walking the grounds, with attempting to befriend servants who regarded me with suspicion. I tried to be a good wife, a proper lady, everything that was expected of me. But the house was so cold. Not physically, though the drafts were considerable, but emotionally, spiritually. The corridors seemed to swallow sound. The portraits on the walls watched me with disapproving eyes. At night, I lay awake in my vast bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house settling around me, and I felt as though I were being slowly suffocated. The second year brought the first cracks. Cedric began staying in London for weeks at a time, citing business obligations that seemed to multiply endlessly. When he returned, there was a new distance in his eyes, a wall that had not been there before. I tried to breach it, tried to rekindle the intimacy we had shared during our courtship, but my attempts were met with impatience, with dismissal, with barely concealed irritation. And then there was the perfume. I first noticed it on a cold evening in November, when Cedric returned from a fortnight in the city. He kissed my cheek as always, a perfunctory gesture devoid of warmth, and as he pulled away, I caught a scent that was not mine. Rose and jasmine, heavy and cloying, nothing like the light lavender water I favored. I said nothing, told myself I was imagining things, but the scent lingered in my mind like a splinter beneath the skin. It appeared again and again over the following weeks, on his coat collar, on his handkerchiefs. Once, on a letter that fell from his pocket, a letter written in a feminine hand with violet ink, sealed with wax but already opened. I did not read it. I was too afraid of what I might find. Finally, I confronted him. I chose my words carefully, kept my voice steady, asked him if there was something he wished to tell me. He looked at me with something that might have been surprise or might have been contempt, and he laughed. He actually laughed. He told me I was being provincial. A man of his station, he said, had needs that a wife could not always satisfy. It was the way of the world, the accepted practice among people of breeding. I should be grateful, he said, that he still came home at all. I remember the way his words fell like stones into the silence between us. I remember the way my heart seemed to crack along lines I had not known existed. I remember thinking that this was not love, had perhaps never been love, had been only a beautiful illusion that I had been too desperate and too foolish to see through. I learned to stop asking. I learned to sleep alone in the vast bed we had once shared, staring at the canopy in the darkness, listening to the silence that filled the space where love should have been. I learned to eat alone in the cavernous dining room, served by footmen who would not meet my eyes, my reflection staring back at me from polished silver and crystal that seemed to mock my isolation. I learned to walk the gardens alone, feeling the eyes of the gardeners upon me, hearing the whispers that followed me like shadows. Poor Lady Blackwood. Married above herself and paying the price. The house staff knew about the mistresses before I did. They always know, the servants. They see everything and say nothing, but their silence speaks volumes. The knowing glances, the pity poorly concealed, the way they would fall silent when I entered a room, as though their conversation had not just been about me. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, haunting the corridors of a place where I had never truly belonged. I tried to make friends among Cedric's set, the lords and ladies who gathered at Blackwood Manor for hunting parties and dinners, but they regarded me as an curiosity at best, an embarrassment at worst. The women were polite but cool, their compliments sharp-edged, their invitations never quite including me. The men looked at me sometimes with an interest that made my skin crawl, as though my low birth made me fair game for their attentions. I learned to retreat to my rooms, to feign headaches and indisposition, to make myself small and invisible. I learned that love, or what I had mistaken for love, was nothing but a transaction, and I had been sold a false bill of goods. The fairy tale I had believed in, the golden prince who had chosen the common girl, was nothing but a story I had told myself to explain why he had wanted me. The truth was simpler and more painful. He had wanted me because I was nobody, because I had no family to defend me, no connections to complicate things, no one who would ask questions when he discarded me. The third year brought worse. Creditors began appearing at the door, their faces grim, their documents stamped with seals of courts and banks. Cedric's investments, it seemed, had failed spectacularly. The Blackwood fortune, which had seemed inexhaustible, was riddled with debt, eaten away by gambling losses and bad speculation and the expensive tastes of his many mistresses. He needed money desperately, and he looked at me as though I were a purse he could turn inside out. It was then that the questions began. Where had I truly come from? Who were my real parents? Was there any inheritance I had failed to mention? I told him the truth, that the Ashfords had left me nothing, that I had no hidden fortune, and he grew angry in a way I had never seen. He accused me of lying, of concealing assets, of trapping him into marriage under false pretenses. The irony would have been laughable if it had not been so painful. I began to fear him. Not physically, though his temper was volatile and his words could cut like knives. I feared what he might discover, what lengths he might go to in his desperation. I feared that my carefully guarded secret, the truth of my parentage, might somehow come to light, and I feared what would happen if it did. One evening in the autumn of 1888, Cedric came to my room with a document in his hand. His face was strange, triumphant, and cruel in equal measure, and he thrust the paper at me without ceremony. It was a petition for annulment, citing fraud and misrepresentation. He intended to dissolve our marriage and cast me out with nothing, not even my reputation. He smiled as he told me, a cold, vicious smile that showed me at last the true face of the man I had married. I asked him why. What had I done to deserve such treatment? What crime had I committed that warranted this destruction? He leaned close, his breath warm against my cheek, smelling of whiskey and tobacco and the perfume that was not mine. And he whispered that he knew about the Vane fortune. He knew I was connected to it somehow. He did not know how, not yet, but he had heard whispers, rumors, hints from men who moved in circles I could not imagine. And if I would not give him what he wanted willingly, he would destroy me so thoroughly that no one would ever believe a word I said. I felt the blood drain from my face. I felt my hands begin to tremble, though I willed them to stillness. I asked him what he was talking about. What Vane fortune? What connection? Trying to buy time, trying to think. But he only smiled and said that we would let the courts sort it out. I did not know how he had learned of my connection to Cornelius Vane. I had never spoken of it, not to anyone, not even in my most private moments. The secret had been entrusted to me by Mrs. Ashford on her deathbed, along with the medallion and the letter, and I had guarded it with everything I had. But Cedric had found out, perhaps through his business associates, perhaps through sheer malicious investigation. It did not matter. What mattered was that he intended to use it against me. The months between that evening and the trial were a kind of purgatory. I remained at Blackwood Manor, a prisoner in all but name, watched by servants who reported my every move to their master. Cedric came and went, sometimes staying for days, sometimes vanishing for weeks, and each time he returned, he had new questions, new accusations, new ways of twisting the knife. He seemed to enjoy my suffering, to take pleasure in my fear. He had become someone I did not recognize, someone I could not believe I had ever loved. I thought about running. I thought about taking the medallion and the letter and disappearing into the labyrinth of London, losing myself among the millions who called the city home. But where would I go? What would I do? I had no money, no friends, no one who would help me. And if I ran, it would only confirm Cedric's accusations. It would prove that I had something to hide. So I stayed. I endured. I waited for the storm to break. The trial began in January of 1889. The courtroom was packed with spectators, aristocrats and journalists and curious onlookers who had come to witness the destruction of a woman who had dared to rise above her station. The chamber smelled of damp wool and ink and the peculiar mustiness of old buildings, and the light filtering through the high windows was gray and weak, as though even the sun could not bear to watch what was about to unfold. I sat in the defendant's chair, dressed in black, my hands folded in my lap. I had chosen the color deliberately, not as mourning, but as armor. I would face my accusers like a widow, like someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. It was a lie, of course. I was terrified, but I would not let them see it. Cedric's barrister was a man named Hector Whitmore, a silver-tongued serpent with cold eyes and an oily smile. He opened by painting me as a scheming adventuress who had seduced an innocent lord with lies and deception. He described my humble origins with barely concealed disgust, implying that anyone of such lowly birth must necessarily be morally deficient. He suggested that I had targeted Cedric deliberately, had researched his family and his fortune, and had set my cap for him with calculating precision. I listened to the lies pour forth like sewage, and I felt something inside me grow very still, very cold. This was not a trial. This was an execution. The verdict had already been decided, and all that remained was the show. They called witnesses, servants from Blackwood Manor who testified that I had been secretive, that I had received mysterious letters, that I had once been seen speaking to a strange man in the garden. I remembered the man, a peddler who had come to the kitchen door selling ribbons and pins, and I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. But laughter would have been taken as evidence of my guilt, so I kept my face still and my eyes fixed on the middle distance. Former acquaintances came forward, people I barely remembered from my years as a governess. They claimed I had always been ambitious, always reaching above my place, always speaking of marriage to a wealthy man as though it were my due. They were lying, or they were misremembering, or they had been paid to say what Cedric wanted them to say. It did not matter. Their words fell like hammer blows, each one driving another nail into my coffin. Lady Blackwood herself took the stand. She wore black silk and diamonds, a study in aristocratic elegance, and she looked at me with eyes full of cold satisfaction. She declared that she had known from the moment she met me that I was not to be trusted. She described my courtship with Cedric as a campaign of seduction, carefully orchestrated to ensnare her innocent son. She said I had brought nothing but misery and disgrace to the Blackwood name, and that the family would be well rid of me. I wanted to tell her that her precious son had gambling debts that would bankrupt the estate. I wanted to tell her about the mistresses, the lies, the casual cruelty he had inflicted on me for years. But I knew no one would believe me. The word of a lady countess against the word of a nobody. There was no contest. I had no one to speak for me. My barrister, a nervous young man named Arthur Pennington, who had been appointed by the court, did his best, but he was outmatched and overwhelmed. He objected when he should have cross-examined. He hesitated when he should have attacked. He looked at me sometimes with something like pity, and I knew he thought I was guilty too. 3 days into the trial, when I had all but given up hope, Julian Hale walked into the courtroom. I did not recognize him at first. He was simply another figure in black, another barrister among the many who had come to watch my humiliation. But there was something different about him, something that drew my eye and held it. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, not like Cedric with his golden hair and patrician features. His face was angular, almost severe, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw and eyes the color of storm clouds. He moved through the crowd with purpose, as though he knew exactly where he was going and would not be deterred, and when he reached the front of the chamber, he did something extraordinary. He announced that he would be taking over my defense. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers and a perpetually exasperated expression, demanded to know by what authority. Whitmore objected strenuously, his oily composure cracking for the first time. Arthur Pennington sputtered in confusion, and I sat frozen in my chair, staring at this stranger who had just inserted himself into my life. Julian produced a letter. written on cream-colored paper with a firm, confident hand. It was a letter of authorization, he said, signed by Lady Eleanor Blackwood herself, requesting that he serve as her counsel. He held it up for the judge to examine, and I saw my own name at the bottom, in handwriting that was not mine but looked convincingly similar. I had never written such a letter. I had never even heard of Julian Hale, but something in his eyes, a flash of warning, told me to stay silent, to trust him, to let this play out. The judge examined the letter. He frowned. He conferred with the court clerk. And finally, with evident reluctance, he accepted it as valid. Julian Hale was now my barrister. The recess that followed was brief but frantic. Julian found me in the corridor outside the courtroom, standing alone while spectators whispered and pointed. He guided me to a small anteroom, closed the door behind us, and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He said his name was Julian Hale, as though I had not just witnessed his dramatic entrance. He said he had been following my case in the papers for weeks. He said he believed I was innocent and that a grave injustice was being done. He said he wanted to help, if I would let him. I asked him who he really was, what he wanted, why he had forged a letter in my name and inserted himself into my life without so much as asking permission. He smiled then, a small, tight smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He said that he was a barrister, as he had claimed. He had made a career of defending those whom society had decided to destroy. Factory workers against their employers, women against husbands who had abused them, the poor against the powerful. He said he had his own reasons for taking on cases like mine, reasons he would explain if I chose to trust him. I asked why I should trust a man who had already lied for me. His smile faded. He said, with perfect seriousness, that I should trust him because he was the only chance I had. That Pennington was incompetent, that Whitmore was ruthless, that the judge was biased and the jury was hostile. That without him, I would lose everything. I knew he was right. I had known it since the first day of the trial, when I had seen the contempt in the jurors' eyes and the satisfaction in Cedric's smile. I had no chance alone. And here was a man offering me a lifeline for reasons I did not understand but was too desperate to question. I told him I would trust him, for now. But I expected the full truth, everything he knew and everything he suspected before this was over. He nodded gravely. He said he would give me the truth, all of it, when the time was right. And then he asked me to tell him everything about myself, the whole truth, the things I had hidden from everyone, even from Cedric. I hesitated. The secret I had kept for a decade, the truth of my parentage, was not something I shared with strangers. But Julian was no longer a stranger. He was my defender, my advocate, my only hope. And something in his eyes, the quiet intensity, the sense that he saw me not as a case but as a person, made me want to believe in him. I told him everything. I told him about the Ashfords and how they had taken me in as an infant. I told him about Mrs. Ashford's deathbed confession. I told him about the medallion with its strange crystal and the letter written in faded ink. I told him about Cornelius Vane, the Baron de Aether, the father I had never known, and the legacy I had never claimed. Julian listened without interruption. His face remained impassive, but I saw something flicker in his eyes when I mentioned Vane's name. Recognition, understanding, and something else I could not quite identify. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, that we were going to win. The trial resumed the next day, and from the moment Julian rose to speak, the atmosphere shifted. He was magnetic, commanding, his voice filling the courtroom like music. He moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but there was substance behind it, a razor-sharp intelligence that cut through pretense and obfuscation. He began by cross-examining the witnesses Whitmore had called. The servants from Blackwood Manor who had testified against me found themselves facing questions they could not answer. How had they known my letters were mysterious if they had not read them? Why had they assumed a conversation with a peddler was evidence of conspiracy? Could they name a single specific action I had taken that could be considered fraudulent? One by one, their testimonies crumbled. The servant who had claimed I received mysterious letters admitted under questioning that he had never actually seen any such letters, only heard rumors from other staff. The former acquaintance who had described my ambition confessed that we had met only twice and had barely exchanged a dozen words. The gardener who had witnessed my conversation with the strange man revealed that he had been told what to say by Lord Blackwood himself. The spectators, who had come expecting to see me destroyed, began to murmur in doubt. The journalists' pens moved faster across their notebooks, and Cedric, sitting at the plaintiff's table, grew visibly agitated, his golden features twisting into something ugly. Julian called into question the provenance of the documents Cedric had submitted, suggesting they had been forged or tampered with. He produced handwriting experts who testified that certain signatures did not match known samples. He introduced financial records that showed discrepancies in Cedric's accounts, payments made to witnesses who had testified against me. He painted a picture not of an innocent lord deceived by a scheming adventuress, but of a desperate man willing to destroy his wife to cover his own failures. On the third day, Cedric took the stand himself. It was a mistake. Julian questioned him with the precision of a surgeon, each question designed to expose a weakness, a contradiction, a lie. He asked about Cedric's finances, about the gambling debts and the failed investments. He asked about the mistresses, naming them one by one, while the courtroom gasped. He asked about the company Cedric kept, the men he met with in private clubs and shadowy offices. And then he asked about the Society of Absolute Progress. I saw Cedric's face change when Julian spoke the name. A flicker of fear, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. He claimed not to know what Julian was talking about. He said he had never heard of such an organization. Julian smiled. It was not a kind smile. He produced documents, bank records and correspondence that he had obtained through means he did not explain. They showed that Cedric had been receiving payments from the society for years in exchange for information and favors. They showed that his interest in the Vane fortune was not personal but professional, that he had been tasked by his associates to uncover the whereabouts of Cornelius Vane's legendary patents and inventions. They suggested that the entire annulment suit was not about saving a noble family from a scheming wife, but about flushing out information about a fortune that powerful men coveted. Cedric denied everything. He called Julian a liar, a fraud, a man with a vendetta. But his denials rang hollow, and I saw doubt flickering in the eyes of the judge and the jury. That night, Julian came to my lodgings. The room was cold, the fire nearly dead, and I was sitting by the window watching the fog roll through the streets below. He knocked softly and I let him in, too exhausted to care about propriety. He brought documents, pages upon pages of research he had conducted in the weeks before the trial. He spread them across my small table and told me what he had learned. The Society of Absolute Progress was an organization of industrialists and scientists, he said, men who believed that progress justified any means. They had been founded decades ago, originally as a legitimate scientific society, but had gradually descended into something darker. They sought to control the technologies that would shape the future, to monopolize the innovations that would determine who had power and who did not. And they had been obsessed with Cornelius Vane. My father, Julian said, had been the greatest inventor of his generation. His discoveries about ether had revolutionized industry, but he had always refused to share his most advanced work with the society. He had seen through their rhetoric of progress, had understood that they cared only for power. He had been their rival, their obstacle, and ultimately their enemy. And then he had died. The official cause of death was heart failure. He had been found in his laboratory, slumped over his workbench, with no signs of violence or foul play. But Julian had believed for years, that Cornelius Vane had been murdered. silenced before he could complete his greatest work or pass it on to someone who might continue it. I asked Julian how he knew all this, why he had devoted years to investigating a dead inventor and a shadowy organization. His face, usually so controlled, flickered with something like grief. He told me about his father. Jonathan Hale had been a patent clerk, a modest man with a keen mind and an uncompromising sense of integrity. He had worked at the patent office for decades, reviewing applications and ensuring that the rights of inventors were protected. And one day, he had stumbled upon something he was not supposed to see. It was a set of documents relating to Cornelius Vane's patents, documents that had been altered, signatures that had been forged, applications that had been rejected on fraudulent grounds. Someone was trying to steal Vane's work, to claim his inventions as their own. And when Jonathan Hale reported what he had found, he had become a target. They had ruined him, not through violence, but through a systematic campaign of destruction, false accusations of corruption, witnesses who suddenly remembered misdeeds that had never occurred. His reputation was shattered, his career ended, his family left destitute. He had died 3 years later, broken and bitter, never having received justice. Julian had been 18 when his father died. He had made a vow at that graveside, much as I had made a vow at the Ashfords' graves. He had devoted his life to fighting the powerful, to defending those whom the powerful had decided to destroy, and he had never stopped investigating the Society of Absolute Progress, waiting for the moment when he could bring them to justice. My case had given him that moment. Through me, through the connection to Cornelius Vane, he had found a way to strike at them. That was why he had taken my case. That was why he had forged a letter in my name and inserted himself into my life. I should have been angry. I had been used, just as Cedric had used me, a means to someone else's end. But I looked at Julian's face, at the pain he could not quite hide, and I understood. We were the same, he and I, children of loss, survivors of betrayal, bound by our wounds and our determination to heal them. I asked him if that was all I was to him, a case, a means to an end. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said very softly that it had started that way, but it had become something more. He said he had never met anyone like me, anyone who could endure what I had endured and still hold her head high. He said he admired me. He said he respected me, and if I would permit it, he said he would like to know me better when all this was over. I did not know how to respond. I had been betrayed so thoroughly by Cedric that the thought of trusting another man seemed impossible. But Julian was not Cedric. Julian did not flatter or charm or make promises he could not keep. He was honest, sometimes brutally so, and that honesty was more valuable to me than all the poetry Cedric had ever recited. I told him we would see. He nodded, accepting my caution without protest, and returned to his work. The 4th day of the trial was the turning point. Whitmore, desperate to regain control, introduced new evidence. He produced a document purporting to show that I had been married before, to a man named George Thornton in Manchester, a man who was still alive. If true, it would mean my marriage to Cedric was bigamous. I would be not merely divorced but disgraced, possibly imprisoned. The social ruin I had feared would be complete. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Journalists scrambled to write the story that would appear in tomorrow's papers. And I sat, frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening, because I had never been to Manchester, had never met anyone named George Thornton, had certainly never married him. Julian demanded to examine the document. When he did, I saw his face go pale with fury. He asked for a brief recess, and when the court reconvened an hour later, he was ready. He called the document a forgery, his voice ringing through the chamber with absolute conviction. He had sent messages to Manchester by telegram during the recess, and he had received responses. The registrar confirmed that no marriage between Eleanor Ashford and George Thornton had ever been recorded. The man who supposedly married me did not exist. His name appeared in no census, no parish record, no document of any kind. Furthermore, Julian said, he had witnesses who could attest to my whereabouts during the period when this supposed marriage had taken place. I had been working as a governess in Hampshire, hundreds of miles from Manchester, employed by a family who could verify my presence. The forgery was clumsy, Julian declared. The work of desperate men who had underestimated the court's ability to discover the truth. He demanded that Whitmore reveal where he had obtained the document and suggested that an investigation into witness tampering and forgery of legal documents was warranted. Whitmore blustered and deflected, but the damage was done. The jury's doubt had curdled into suspicion. The spectators who had come to see me destroyed were now murmuring about conspiracy and corruption. And Cedric, at the plaintiff's table, looked like a man watching his world collapse. But Julian was not finished. He asked the court's permission to present evidence that would establish my true identity, evidence that would explain why Lord Blackwood was so desperate to destroy me, why he had gone to such lengths, committed such crimes, to win this case. The judge hesitated. Whitmore objected strenuously, but Julian argued that the evidence was directly relevant, that it would prove I had no motive to deceive anyone, that justice demanded it be heard. The judge, after a long moment of deliberation, agreed. Julian turned to me. His eyes met mine, steady and reassuring. He asked if I was ready. I looked at him, at this man who had appeared from nowhere and changed everything. I looked at the courtroom full of strangers, at Cedric's pale and furious face, at the journalists with their pens poised. I thought of the Ashfords, who had raised me and loved me. I thought of Cornelius Vane, who had abandoned me to protect me. I thought of the vow I had made at my parents' graves, to keep the secret, to stay invisible, to never reveal who I truly was. And I thought of the woman I had become in these years of silence and suffering. The woman who had endured a loveless marriage, endured mockery and contempt, endured the slow suffocation of living a lie. That woman was tired. That woman was ready for the truth. I rose from my seat. I walked to the witness stand, and I told them everything. I told them about being left on the doorstep of the Ashford home in the winter of 1862, wrapped in a blanket embroidered with gears and stars. I told them about the medallion of brass and silver containing a crystal that pulsed with faint light. I told them about Mrs. Ashford's confession, the man who had come in the night, the oath of secrecy that had bound them for a quarter century. I told them about Cornelius Vane. The name rippled through the courtroom like a stone thrown into still water. Everyone knew of Cornelius Vane, the reclusive genius who had revolutionized industry, the inventor whose patents were worth millions, the legend whose laboratory had been sealed since his mysterious death 5 years before, the man whose heir, if one existed, would inherit not just a fortune, but a legacy that could reshape the world. I produced the medallion. I held it up so the light caught the crystal at its center, and a collective gasp rose from the assembly. Some of them had seen drawings of it, I realized. Some of them knew what it meant. I produced the letter, written in Cornelius Vane's own hand. I read it aloud, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. It explained that I was his daughter, born of a brief union with a woman named Clara who had died in childbirth. It explained that he had enemies who would use me against him. It explained that he had given me away to protect me, that the medallion was proof of my identity, that I was to reveal myself only if my life depended on it. Julian produced corroborating evidence. He had tracked down the notary who had witnessed Cornelius Vane's will, an elderly man named Mr. Cartwright who had been bound by oath to secrecy until called upon by a court of law. The notary testified, his voice quavering with age, but firm with conviction, that the will named one heir and one heir only, a daughter identified by the medallion and the letter. He had kept copies of both in a sealed vault for 5 years, waiting for this moment. And they matched, perfectly, the items I had presented. The courtroom was silent. I saw Cedric's face, white as chalk, his composure finally shattered. I saw Lady Blackwood clutching her handkerchief, her eyes wide with disbelief. I saw the journalists scribbling furiously, already composing the headlines that would appear in tomorrow's papers. And I saw Julian, standing before the court, his voice steady as he asked the judge to dismiss the case against me, to acknowledge my true identity as Eleanor Vane, daughter and sole heir of Cornelius Vane, to order an investigation into Lord Blackwood's conduct and his connections to the Society of Absolute Progress, to deliver, at last, the justice that had been denied for too long. The judge retired to consider. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I sat in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, Julian beside me, neither of us speaking. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, the enormity of what I had done. I had revealed myself. After a decade of hiding, I had stepped into the light. There was no going back now. At some point, Julian reached over and took my hand. His fingers were warm, strong, and I realized that I did not want him to let go. I held on, drawing strength from his presence, from the steady beat of his pulse against my palm. When the judge returned, his verdict was clear. The annulment petition was denied. The evidence presented by Lord Blackwood had been shown to be fraudulent, fabricated to support false accusations. I was declared the legitimate daughter and sole heir of Cornelius Vane, and an inquiry would be opened into the activities of Lord Cedric Blackwood and the Society of Absolute Progress, with possible charges to follow. I walked out of that courtroom a different person than I had entered. Eleanor Ashford was gone, swallowed up by the past. In her place stood Eleanor Vane, heiress to a fortune and a mystery that had haunted England for a decade. The fog had lifted while we were inside. The afternoon sun slanted through the clouds, weak but present, gilding the wet cobblestones with pale gold. Julian walked beside me, silent but alert, ready to shield me from the reporters who swarmed around us like flies. Questions pelted me from all sides, a cacophony of demands and accusations and pleas for comment. I said nothing. There would be time for words later. For now, I simply wanted to breathe. We found a hansom cab and escaped into the relative quiet of the London streets. Julian sat across from me, watching me with those storm-gray eyes, and I wondered what he saw. A woman who had just reclaimed her birthright? A client whose case was won? Or something more, something neither of us had dared to name? I asked him what happened now. He said that we had a great deal of work to do. The estate would need to be sorted, the laboratory opened, the patents reviewed. The society would not accept their defeat quietly. They would regroup, reassess, find new ways to claim what they believed was theirs. We would need to be vigilant. I said that I could not do it alone. He said that I would not have to. The weeks that followed the trial were a blur of activity. Solicitors descended upon me with contracts and documents explaining the extent of the Vane estate with breathless reverence. Bankers appeared, offering their services with the eagerness of men who had discovered a new and lucrative client. Journalists continued their siege, publishing stories that ranged from the sympathetic to the scandalous. I learned to navigate this new world with the help of Julian and a small circle of professionals he had assembled, people he trusted, which meant people I could trust too. Cornelius Vane's estate had been sealed since his death in 1884, locked away by court order until a legitimate heir could be found. Now that I had been recognized, the seals were lifted, and I was granted access to everything he had left behind. His townhouse in Mayfair, shrouded in dust sheets and silence. His accounts at Coutts, containing sums that made my head spin. And his laboratory, the sprawling complex on the outskirts of London where he had conducted his experiments and made his discoveries. It was the laboratory that drew me most. I knew that answers awaited me there, answers to questions I had carried all my life. Who was my father truly? What had he discovered? What had killed him? And what had he left for me to find? Julian accompanied me on my first visit. I had asked him to come, telling myself it was because I needed legal counsel, because the estate was complicated and I required guidance. But the truth was simpler. I wanted him there. I wanted his steadiness, his clarity, his presence beside me as I stepped into my father's world. The laboratory was located in Hampstead, hidden behind high walls and iron gates that had not been opened in 5 years. The grounds were overgrown, the paths buried under weeds and fallen leaves, and the building itself had a forlorn, abandoned air. But it was not neglected, I realized as we approached. It was waiting for someone with the key. The key was my medallion. I pressed it against a panel beside the main door, and something clicked deep within the mechanism. The doors swung open, releasing a gust of stale air that smelled of chemicals and dust and something else, something that hummed at the edge of perception. Inside, the laboratory was like nothing I had imagined. The entrance hall resembled an ordinary manor, with wood-paneled walls and a marble floor. But beyond the entrance, the walls were lined with copper pipes and brass fittings, and machines of incomprehensible design stood in alcoves like mechanical sentinels. The air vibrated with a faint energy that seemed to resonate in my bones. Ether, I realized, the substance my father had spent his life studying. It was everywhere here, contained in glass tubes and crystal chambers, powering lights that flickered to life as we entered. We explored together, room by room. There were workshops filled with half-finished inventions, devices of gears and lenses and delicate wires whose purposes I could not guess. There were libraries crammed with notebooks, thousands of pages covered in my father's cramped handwriting, recording experiments and observations and theories that made my head spin. There were storage rooms containing materials I did not recognize, metals that glowed faintly and liquids that seemed to shift color when I looked at them. The deeper we went, the stranger the laboratory became. In one room, we found a collection of clocks, hundreds of them, all stopped at the same time. In another, mirrors lined every surface, reflecting our images into infinity. In a third, a massive pipe organ dominated the space, its keys made of crystal that chimed with an unearthly resonance when I touched them. And then we found the locked door. It was at the heart of the complex, a heavy iron door with no visible keyhole. There was only a small circular indentation in its surface, about the size of a large coin. I knew, without being told, what it was for. I pressed my medallion into the indentation. There was a click, a whir of hidden mechanisms, and the door swung open. Beyond was a chamber unlike any I had seen. It was vast, circular, with a domed ceiling that rose to a point high above. At the center stood a towering apparatus of glass and metal, a structure that rose like a frozen fountain, tubes and wires spiraling upward in a complex helix. And at its heart, suspended in a web of delicate filaments, was a crystal larger than my head. It pulsed with soft blue light, not steadily but rhythmically, like a heartbeat. And as I watched, I realized that the light was not uniform. There were shapes within it, forms that moved and shifted like smoke in a jar. Human shapes. Julian stepped back, his hand going to my arm. He asked me what I was seeing, his voice taut with concern, and I realized, with a chill that went deeper than cold, that he could not see them. The shapes were visible only to me. I approached the apparatus, drawn by something I could not name. Perhaps it was the medallion, which seemed to grow warm against my skin as I drew near. Perhaps it was something in my blood, the legacy my father had passed down without ever meeting me. Whatever it was, it pulled me forward, step by step, until I stood at the very edge of the crystal's light. The shapes became clearer as I approached. Faces emerged from the luminescence, features blurred but distinctly human. Men and women, young and old, their expressions frozen in something between confusion and yearning. They were not alive, not in any sense I understood. But they were not dead either. They were something else, something between, caught in the glow like insects preserved in amber. One of them turned toward me. It was a woman, Middle-aged, her features indistinct but somehow familiar. She had dark hair, like mine, and eyes that seemed to search my face with desperate intensity. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged, only a wave of emotion, a feeling that washed over me with overwhelming force. Grief, guilt, a desperate, aching need to be understood. I stumbled backward, gasping. Julian caught me, held me steady, his arms strong around me. He asked what had happened, what I had seen. I tried to find words for something that defied description, tried to explain the faces in the light, the wave of emotion, the terrible sense that these beings were trapped, imprisoned, crying out for help that never came. Julian listened, his face grave. When I finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that we needed to understand what my father had been doing here, that the answers might be in his notebooks, that we should take nothing for granted and trust nothing until we had uncovered the truth. I agreed. And so began the long, painstaking work of piecing together Cornelius Vane's legacy. The notebooks were a labyrinth. My father had been brilliant, but his brilliance had been scattered, undisciplined, leaping from topic to topic with dizzying speed. There were entries on ether extraction, on energy transfer, on the construction of machines that could harness the substance for everything from lighting cities to powering factories. These were the discoveries that had made him famous, the patents that had earned him his fortune. But there were also entries of a different kind, entries that spoke of experiments at the edges of science, at the borders of the known world. My father had believed that ether was not merely a physical substance, but a spiritual one. He had theorized that it was the medium through which consciousness existed, the invisible fabric that connected all living things. In his notebooks, he wrote of experiments designed to test this theory, to capture and preserve consciousness outside the body, to offer a form of immortality to those who feared death. The spirits I had seen in the crystal were the results of these experiments. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense, not the souls of the dead returning to haunt the living. They were fragments, impressions, echoes of consciousness that my father had managed to trap in concentrated ether. He had believed he was doing them a kindness, offering them continuation beyond the grave. He had worked with dying patients, with volunteers who feared oblivion, promising them eternal existence in the light of the crystal. But something had gone wrong. Reading his later entries, I watched my father's optimism curdle into despair. The fragments were not whole. They could not communicate, could not think, could not feel in any coherent way. They were prisoners of their own preservation, locked in an endless twilight between life and death. They could sense the world outside, could feel emotions dimly, could yearn for release. But they could not escape. My father had tried to free them. His final notebooks were filled with desperate calculations, attempts to reverse the process, to release the trapped consciousnesses and let them pass on to whatever lay beyond. He had built machines designed to open the crystal, to dissolve the ether bonds, to set them free. But he had failed. Every attempt had ended in failure, and with each failure, his desperation had grown. And then, shortly after his last entry, he had died. The official cause was heart failure. He had been found in this very chamber, slumped against the base of the crystal apparatus with no signs of violence. The authorities had concluded that he had worked himself to death, had pushed his aging body past its limits in pursuit of his obsessive goal. But as I read deeper into his papers, I began to suspect otherwise. There were references to visitors in the weeks before his death, men who came at night and left before dawn, whose names my father never recorded, but whose presence clearly disturbed him. There were mentions of threats, of demands, of pressure to hand over his research. And there was a single entry, undated and barely legible, scrawled in a hand that trembled with fear or exhaustion. They will not stop until they have it all. They do not understand what they ask for. They do not know what she contains. If I cannot destroy the crystal, I must hide it. And if I cannot hide it, I must ensure that only she can find it. My daughter, my Eleanor. Forgive me for the burden I leave you. She, the crystal. The apparatus that held the trapped spirits was not merely a machine. It was a vessel, and within it was something my father had valued more than his own life. I returned to the chamber with new eyes. I approached the crystal again, ignoring Julian's concerned questions, and I looked more closely at the shapes within. The woman I had seen before, the one with dark hair and searching eyes, seemed to glow brighter than the others. She turned toward me as I approached, and this time, when the wave of emotion washed over me, I understood what it meant. Mother, Clara, the woman who had died giving me life. My father had captured her consciousness in the crystal, had preserved her in Aether so that she would never truly be gone. He had spent years trying to free her, to give her the peace she deserved, but he had failed. And now she was trapped forever, a prisoner of his love. I wept then. I stood before my mother's ghost and wept for the parents I had never known, for the sacrifices they had made, for the legacy of pain and love they had left behind. Julian came to me, held me, let me cry against his shoulder until I had no tears left. When I could speak again, I told him what I had discovered. He listened, his face pale, his eyes dark with something I could not name. And then he said that we could not leave her like this, that we had to find a way to free her, to free all of them. I said that my father had tried, that he had failed, that there might not be a way. Julian said that my father had worked alone, that he had been hunted and desperate and out of time. We had resources he had lacked. We had allies. We had each other. And we would not give up until we had succeeded. I looked at him, at this man who had appeared in my life like a storm and changed everything. I saw the determination in his eyes, the fierce compassion, and I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been frozen for years, locked away behind walls of fear and distrust, began to thaw. I did not name it. I was not ready. But I recognized it for what it was, and I did not push it away. The weeks that followed were consumed by research. Julian brought in experts, scientists, and spiritualists and scholars of the occult, anyone who might offer insight into my father's work. We studied the notebooks, deciphered the formulas, recreated the experiments on a smaller scale. We learned more about Aether than I had ever imagined, its properties and its limitations, its potential for creation and destruction. And through it all, the Society of Absolute Progress watched and waited. They had not abandoned their pursuit. If anything, my victory in court had made them more determined. There were attempts to break into the laboratory, foiled by the security measures my father had installed. There were threatening letters, anonymous and menacing, warning me to abandon my claims and disappear. There were incidents in the streets, near misses with runaway carts and sudden collapses of scaffolding, too frequent to be coincidence. Julian hired guards, former soldiers who patrolled the laboratory grounds with military precision. He arranged for my lodgings to be watched, for my movements to be monitored and protected. He was tireless in his vigilance, and I was grateful, though I worried about the toll it was taking on him. We grew closer in those weeks. The late nights spent poring over notebooks, the shared meals in the laboratory's dusty dining room, the conversations that ranged from science to philosophy to the small details of our lives. I learned about his childhood, about the modest house in Clerkenwell where he had grown up, about the father who had taught him to read using legal documents and parliamentary debates. I learned about the years after his father's death, the desperate scramble for scholarships and positions, the long nights studying by candlelight because he could not afford gas. He had clawed his way into the legal profession through sheer determination, and he had never forgotten where he came from. He learned about me, about the loneliness of the governess years, the slow death of my marriage, the weight of secrets I had carried alone. He listened without judgment when I spoke of Cedric, of the hope that had curdled into despair, of the love that had been revealed as nothing more than convenience. He did not try to comfort me with platitudes or promises. He simply listened, and in his listening, I found a comfort deeper than words. We took walks together in the overgrown gardens of the laboratory, paths that my father had once tended but that had grown wild in the years since his death. Julian told me stories about his cases, the workers he had defended, the small victories that had sustained him through the larger defeats. I told him about the books I had loved, the ideas that had shaped me, the dreams I had buried when I married Cedric and thought my life was settled. There was an evening when we sat together in the conservatory, watching the sun set through glass walls that needed cleaning, and he asked me what I would do when all of this was over. When the society was defeated, the laboratory was sorted, the estate was settled. What did I want for my life? I did not know how to answer. I had spent so long reacting, surviving, enduring, that I had forgotten how to dream. I told him that I wanted to honor my father's memory, that I wanted to use his inventions for good rather than exploitation, that I wanted to matter, to make a difference, to be more than a footnote in someone else's story. He looked at me with those storm-gray eyes, and he said that I already mattered, that I had always mattered, that the only person who had failed to recognize it was me. I do not know what came over me in that moment. Perhaps it was the light, golden and forgiving. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, the defenses I could no longer maintain. Perhaps it was simply that I was tired of being alone, tired of keeping everyone at arm's length, tired of the walls I had built to protect a heart that still, despite everything, wanted to be loved. I reached out and touched his face. His skin was warm beneath my fingers, rough with stubble, and he went very still. His eyes searched mine, asking a question I could not answer with words, and so I answered it another way. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative. Two people who had been hurt too many times to trust their own hearts. But it deepened, became something more, and when we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, I knew that something had changed between us, something that could not be unchanged. He never pressed for more than I was willing to give. He never demanded declarations or commitments. He simply stayed, steadfast and patient, and let me find my way to him in my own time. One evening, late in March, I found the answer. I was alone in the laboratory, the guards having retired to their posts, the other researchers having gone home for the night. I sat in my father's study, surrounded by his notebooks, searching for something I could not name, a clue, a hint, a way forward. And then I found it. Hidden in the margins of a notebook I had read a dozen times, so small and faint I had missed it before, was a diagram. It showed the crystal apparatus with a modification I had not seen, an additional component connected to the base. Beside it was a single word: dissolve. I studied the diagram with trembling hands. It was incomplete, rough, clearly a sketch made in haste. But it suggested a possibility, a way to unmake what my father had made, to release the trapped consciousnesses from their ether prison. The modification required a specific component, something my father had labeled only with a symbol I did not recognize. I searched his notes for an explanation, for any reference that might tell me what it was, and finally I found it. The symbol represented condensed ether in its purest form. The same substance that filled the crystal, but refined and concentrated to an even greater degree. My father had called it the heart, and he had hidden it somewhere in the laboratory to be found only by someone who knew where to look. I searched for hours. I opened every cabinet, every drawer, every hidden compartment I could find. I tapped on walls, listening for hollow spaces. I examined the machines, looking for secret chambers. And just before dawn, I found it. It was in the organ room, hidden inside the largest pipe, accessible only by climbing a ladder and reaching into the darkness. A small vial of crystal, no larger than my thumb, filled with blue light so intense it hurt to look at directly. The heart. I brought it to Julian that morning, showed him what I had discovered, explained the modification and what I believed it could do. He listened with growing wonder and then asked me if I was sure. If I was ready to attempt something that might fail, might destroy the crystal entirely, might release the spirits into oblivion rather than peace. I said I was not sure. I said I might never be sure. But I could not leave my mother trapped in that twilight. I could not leave any of them there. I had to try. We made preparations. Julian summoned Mrs. Thornwood, a spiritualist who had known my father and understood his theories. She was an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, and she greeted me with a warmth that suggested she had been expecting me for a long time. She examined the crystal, communing with the spirits in ways I could not comprehend. She told me that they were aware of my presence, that they knew I was Cornelius Vane's daughter. She said that they were tired, so tired, and that they longed for rest. She said that my mother's spirit was the strongest of them, the one who had held on longest, waiting for the daughter she had never held. I wept again. Mrs. Thornwood held my hand and told me that tears were nothing to be ashamed of, that love and grief were two sides of the same coin, that what I was about to do was an act of mercy, and my mother would understand. We performed the procedure on a clear night in April, when the moon was dark and the stars burned bright above Hampstead. Julian stood at my side, his hand in mine. Mrs. Thornwood spoke words in a language I did not know, prayers or incantations or simply an expression of hope, and I, with trembling hands, inserted the heart into the base of the apparatus and activated the modification my father had designed. The crystal blazed with light. The chamber filled with a sound like singing, a chorus of voices too faint and too beautiful to comprehend. The shapes within the crystal grew brighter, more distinct, their features sharpening into clarity for the first time. I saw my mother clearly then. She looked at me with eyes full of love and sorrow and pride. She smiled, a smile that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. And then she raised her hand, palm outward, as if pressing against a window she could finally see through. I raised my hand to match hers. Our palms aligned, separated by nothing more than light. And in that moment, I felt something pass between us. A blessing. A farewell. A mother's final gift to the child she had never known. The light intensified, became blinding, and I squeezed my eyes shut against it. When I opened them again, the crystal was dark. The apparatus was silent. The shapes were gone. They were free. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed with grief and relief and a strange, profound peace. Julian knelt beside me, held me close, whispered words of comfort I could not hear over the roaring in my ears. Mrs. Thornwood wept openly, her tears catching the dim light that remained. It was done. After years of imprisonment, the spirits had been released. My mother had found rest at last. And I, Eleanor Vane, had fulfilled my father's final wish. The months that followed were not easy. The society made one final attempt to claim my inheritance, a coordinated assault that involved legal challenges, physical threats, and a plot to have me declared mentally unfit. Julian fought them at every turn, using the evidence we had gathered to expose their corruption, to turn their allies against them, to drag their secrets into the light. The confrontation came to a head at a private tribunal, a gathering of industrialists and noblemen who had been deceived into supporting the society's claims. It was held in a grand hall in the city, its marble columns and gilded ceiling speaking of wealth and power accumulated over generations. The men who sat in judgment were gray-haired and stone-faced, their eyes cold with calculation, their tailored coats and silk cravats marking them as the masters of industry and empire. Cedric was among them, I noticed, with grim satisfaction. He sat at the far end of the long table, looking diminished somehow, a puppet whose strings had been revealed. He would not meet my eyes when I entered, and I was glad. I had no desire to see his face, to remember the man I had once loved, to feel the ghost of feelings that should have died long ago. I attended despite Julian's objections, determined to face my enemies directly. He had wanted me to stay at the laboratory, protected by guards and distance, but I was done hiding. I was done letting others fight my battles. If the society wanted to destroy me, they would have to do it to my face. Lord Aldous Crane, the leader of the society, was there. He was tall and thin, with a face like a skull and eyes that held no warmth. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and cultured, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. He welcomed me with a courtesy that made my skin crawl, offered me a seat as though I were a guest rather than a defendant, smiled a smile that never reached his hollow eyes. They questioned me for hours, a slow and grinding inquisition designed to wear me down. They asked about my father's work, about the contents of the laboratory, about the nature of the crystal and what it could do. They probed for weaknesses, for contradictions, for anything they could use against me. I answered carefully, revealing nothing of importance, deflecting and evading with a skill I had learned in Cedric's house, where every word could be turned into a weapon. And then, when they grew frustrated with my evasions, Crane played his final card. He rose from his seat at the head of the table and approached me slowly, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He said he had been looking forward to meeting me. He said I was remarkable, just as my father had been remarkable. He said it would be a shame, a terrible shame, if I met the same unfortunate end. I asked him if that was a threat. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing, though every instinct screamed at me to run. But I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. I would not bend. He laughed, a dry, papery sound that held no humor. He said it was merely an observation. The world was a dangerous place, especially for those who possessed knowledge that others coveted. Accidents happened. Tragedies befell even the most careful individuals. Fires broke out in laboratories. Carriages overturned on dark roads. Women who lived alone sometimes met with unfortunate ends. But such unpleasantness could be avoided, he assured me, if I was willing to be reasonable. I asked what he considered reasonable. He said he wanted the crystal, all of it, and the notebooks, and the patents, and everything else my father had left behind. In exchange, he would ensure my safety, my comfort, a quiet life far from the concerns of men like him. I could marry again, he suggested, find some minor lord who would be grateful for a wealthy wife, live out my days in peace and obscurity. It was, he insisted, a generous offer, more generous than I deserved. I looked at him, at his hollow eyes and his corpse-like face, and I felt something rising in me, something hot and fierce and uncontainable. I thought of my father, dead in his laboratory, his life's work stolen and perverted by men like this. I thought of my mother, trapped in the crystal, a prisoner of love and desperation. I thought of the spirits I had freed, the souls who had yearned for release, while Crane and his kind sought only to exploit what my father had created. I thought of Cedric, who had claimed to love me and had sold me to these monsters for the price of his debts. And I thought of Julian, waiting outside with a plan we had crafted together, trusting me to play my part. I told Crane that his offer was declined. I told him that I intended to expose the society and everything it had done. I told him that my father's work would not be used to enslave or exploit or destroy. And I told him that if he threatened me again, I would make him regret it for whatever remained of his miserable life. Crane's smile faded. His eyes went hard, and for a moment I saw the killer beneath the gentleman's mask, the predator behind the polished facade. He said I was making a grave mistake. He said I would not leave this hall alive. But he was wrong. The doors burst open, and Julian strode in with officers of the Metropolitan Police. He had been building this moment for weeks, gathering evidence, securing warrants, coordinating with sympathetic officials. Crane and his associates were arrested on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. Cedric, who had been among them, collapsed into tears and was led away in disgrace. Justice, at last. I opened the laboratory to scientists and inventors who shared my father's vision of progress tempered by ethics. I funded schools for working-class children to learn the sciences. I established a foundation in my father's name to support research that would benefit humanity rather than exploit it. I became a patron of the arts, a defender of the vulnerable, a force for good in a world that needed more of it. And through it all, Julian remained with me. He resigned from his legal practice to help me manage the foundation. We worked together, lived together, built something together that was greater than either of us alone. The tension between us, the unspoken feelings that had simmered for months, finally found expression on a quiet evening in the library when he took my hand and asked if I would permit him to court me properly. I laughed then, for the first time in longer than I could remember. I told him that propriety had never been his strong suit. He smiled and agreed, and then he kissed me, a kiss that was gentle and fierce and full of promise. We were married in the autumn of that year, in the garden of the Hampstead Laboratory, with the iron gates thrown open and the roses in full bloom. It was a small ceremony, attended by friends who had become family. Mrs. Thornwood presided, speaking words of blessing in a voice that seemed to carry beyond the mortal world. It was not the wedding I had once dreamed of, the one with white lace and cathedral bells. It was better. It was real. It was ours. I think sometimes of the woman I used to be, the frightened governess who hid her true self behind a borrowed name. She seems like a stranger now, a character from a story I read long ago. I am Eleanor Vane Hale, daughter of inventors, wife of a remarkable man, mistress of my own fate. I have known betrayal and heartbreak, fear and despair. I have faced ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, confronted enemies who sought to destroy me, carried burdens that no one should have to bear. But I have also known courage and redemption, and a love that was worth waiting for. I have freed spirits from their prison and brought criminals to justice. I have built something meaningful from the wreckage of my past. I have become the woman I was always meant to be. The past is behind me. The future stretches ahead, uncertain and unwritten, and I face it without fear because I know now what I am capable of. I know what I have survived, and I know that whatever comes next, I will meet it with my head held high, with my husband at my side, with the memory of my mother's smile warming my heart. This is my story. This is my truth. And no one, not society, not scandal, not the ghosts of my own doubt, can ever take it from me. The fog still hangs over London sometimes, thick and gray as it ever was. But through it, always, I can see the light.